The Game Dev Show back here with Jason Story and Greg. And today we're going to mostly just be talking to the audience and chatting. We don't have any big topics. No big stories have kicked off this week, at least that I know about in the game dev world. We're just going to kind of hang out, chill, and chat about a couple things. Story, you mentioned you were playing the new Spider-Man game, which I haven't had a chance to play at all. How is it? Is it worth grabbing and checking?
It's good. I'm 74% through at the moment. After I think it's been 4 days. I've just been playing sort of a session every evening after work for a little bit. It's pretty good. I mean, the thing about the Spider-Man games is all three of them are nearly identical in not just the gameplay, not just the style, but they all use a 3-act narrative structure with the same kind of hero-villain structure. Like, even if you didn't know about narrative structure stuff, you may not pick it up the first time, but by the third one, you'd be able to tell exactly what would happen in the entire game from like the first 5 minutes, because they set everything up in exactly the same structural way. That doesn't bother me too much. Like, you're not playing Spider-Man games for the story, which is, again, it's a pity because the writing is good. The visual effects are fantastic. They have really good set piece moments where you're like flying through exploded buildings and stuff and chasing characters through a city, and there's all sorts of cool moments. It's just not particularly surprising in every beat that's going to happen. As for mechanics, the one new thing they added was they basically took the wingsuit from Just Cause or Batman, and that's your new thing. So as well as swinging, you can now like start hovering a bit, which actually adds quite a lot to the movement mechanic, which is cool.
Nice. Yeah, I need to try it out. Yeah, I'm still behind. I'm still trying to get a couple of more hours in the Starfield and stuff, and it's just constantly out of time with all the fun new stuff that keeps coming out. You've been playing anything new, Greg, or you've just been working on your own game?
I played a little bit of Minecraft on a friend's server, but other than that, I did find out about a game called did we talk about it last week? The yarn-based game, Unravel 2.
I think loosely, yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to start playing with that with my wife, I think. I did play around with it a little bit just to get used to the mechanics. What I like about that is it's a cooperative puzzle solving game, so you have to work together to get over obstacles and stuff.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll probably never get around to trying it. It sounds like a lot of fun.
But Story, I wanted to ask, that hover mechanic you were talking about, is that similar to like the elytra in Minecraft? Are you familiar with that?
I'm not.
The wings you can get in the end city.
Yeah, I dropped out of Minecraft around the time the dragon was added, so that was quite a while ago.
Wow. All right.
So there was a question about your GitHub repo, Jason, that you posted last week.
Oh yes, yeah, it's on GitHub. I don't have a link handy. Let me see.
Yeah, so we can post a link to it. What was on that GitHub repo again?
That was my kind of 3D starter kit. It's sort of just a set of basic configurations that I do for 3D projects with all of the prefabs and defaults set up correctly or correctly to how I do it, as well as, set up textures, lighting, post-processing, all of the stuff you'd want from again, I made it for me, as in I wanted to play with some ideas. I want to make a 3D project, and I don't want to set up input or character controller or UI or raycasting or, trigger boxes or doors or pro builder and level creation. So it's just all of that stuff. In theory, you can press play, walk around, and then if you want to start building mechanics and testing stuff, you can just modify the character file. There you go.
Yeah, and it's essentially just like a 3D starter kit, kind of like what Unity has, but I think it's I would say it's probably a better version. My personal opinion, just looking at it.
Yeah, it's certainly what I want. It's just sort of like I wanted to get rid of all the cruft, none of the basics, none of the stuff that you don't want, and I'll get rid of just the defaults of things, like you're not using liberation sands for all of my text, all the stuff that is like the default TextMesh Pro stuff. So yeah, I think I said before, I'm quite impressed with how far free assets have gotten, because normally normally I wouldn't bother doing this because I would want a paid character controller, or I would be using a paid tweening library or various other assets that are, I would upgrade. Now, there are still paid assets I put into my own projects, but as a starting point, like the majority of an actual project is now entirely free, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, there's a lot of really good free stuff now kind of built in. Oh, I would add audio add it as a comment.
Yeah, audio is an interesting one because I wanted to do audio for it, but that's one of those things where it goes back to it's for me is 99% of the time I use a combination of choreographer and F mod for my audio. Choreographer is a paid asset, and F mod is very complicated to set up if you don't know what you're doing. And so if I was to give a project out with F mod for audio, people would be like, I don't know how to do this. And so I kind of felt like stopping in the public version at exactly around Unity Audio was probably good enough. And then I'll do all the other stuff in my own project. So I probably don't want to create stuff that I would never use, which would be the default audio system. So I might create some scripts and things that if people do use Fmod, if I ever did a tutorial, I could go down that road. But yeah, I don't think I'll ever really do an Fmod sample project, or at least not without like a lot of tutorial stuff to go with it, because it's a bit confusing with directory setups and stuff.
Yeah, adding Fmod in there would be definitely overkill, and even adding audio is probably overkill for what you're trying to do there, which is like that third-person movement controller with some basic lighting, and I mean you've essentially got like a third-person character controller set up that you run around and explore a world, and it's for kind of I think that kind of game, and whatever audio you added in there would be probably pretty untied to that character setup and stuff. So it doesn't, I don't think, make a lot of sense to add it necessarily in there unless you were building out a full sample project, which, yeah, then you're going to be using probably Fmod and confusing the living shit out of everybody, right? But yeah, like I said, you'd have to build up all those extra tutorials around it so people could actually understand it. And it
Even the Fmod I use, so Fmod is native stuff, so it's not even like there's a wrapper library they give you, but if you want to do anything fancier, you have to bypass the wrapper they give you and do more stuff. So without going into a whole big tangent on it, one of the things I like to do in almost all my projects is get the spectrum data. Because even if you don't know what you're going to do later, every sound that plays out of either an audio source or from Fmod, you can grab just the big old byte array of spectrum data or all the floats of like what's going on. And they don't provide any processing for it. You have to write your own band parser and split it up into reasonable sized bands for yourself and make a band buffer if you want to smooth out the values to make them softer. So you write all of that stuff, but to get that access to that, you have to do a bit of interesting things, like you have to create a DSP object and associate it with an event and go through the process. But once you do that, and because I didn't want to do it every time, I wrote a bunch of helper tools that basically say create music, and it does all of this stuff. And then I can subscribe to music events, and I get I can have things bounce or move relative to the music. So yeah, even if I was to use Fmod, I would put a lot of stuff on top of it, which would make it even more confusing. So
that's the problem with trying to teach stuff, because when you want to teach anything that's too advanced, it requires so much more like prerequisite teaching stuff. That actually kind of reminds me. So one of the things I was talking about earlier in the call with students right before the show was in the coursework and samples. I was talking about, because I was working on my multiplayer coursework stuff here, and I was talking about how in most of the parts of it, and try to be as unopinionated as possible, so that it can focus the opinionated stuff 100% on the multiplayer aspect, and the part that's kind of focused, like on like what I want people to learn and understand. So you use some simple singletons. There's no special system, no dependency injection, no complicated system that they have to understand how these messages are going back and forth. They can plug it into whatever type of setup that they want to use at their own setup. Same with like the interface and everything else. It's pretty straightforward and simple, so that until it gets into the actual multiplayer networking code. And I found that, sorry, this was kind of a long rant, but it came from, I kept looking at all of these samples that are out there, and finding that like you want to figure out how to do some simple stuff like set up a lobby or send some messages back and forth or do some movement stuff with a multiplayer sample. And you've got like 10 other concepts that you've got to figure out first before you even get to the multiplayer part. It's like, oh yeah, you got to figure out how all these things are injected, the 6 layers of these objects and things, before you even figure out where the messages are being sent around and how that's being done. And I feel like while it's good for showing like a full-on example of how you might do things, putting the opinionated stuff in samples makes it very, very difficult to digest. I always found that to be the case when I was trying to learn from samples, and I think that it's probably still the case for most people on things like that. And I don't know, I was thinking about it, and I was kind of curious what your guys' thoughts were on the whole topic of like when you're making, because you're talking about with Fmod specifically, kind of pushed it straight to the front of my head. But I'm curious what you guys think about it, and like if you're making samples, how much of that do you do like your own very opinionated way of doing things versus keeping it less opinionated, and yeah, how do you balance that? I don't know, just a thought for discussion, I guess.
So I think it depends on whether I'm showing how to make a specific game, like for my Defender tutorial or Cubert tutorial or something. I would probably make that pretty opinionated. And here's how I would make this kind of game. But if I'm trying to make something generic, like my music manager, I try to not make it so opinionated. And the whole thing with the assets too, I like to use a mixture of free and paid assets. I mean, for my own game, I'm probably going to use mostly paid assets. But if I'm making a tutorial, and especially if I'm going to be publishing the code for the tutorial on GitHub, I only want to use free assets so that my viewers can download it and follow along. But some of my more recent tutorials, I've been kind of showing off some other, like Andrew's Infinity PBR assets, that Endless Book asset. And I share links for them in the description in case anybody wants to pick them up. So it really depends on if I'm showing like a specific game, and I might make it more opinionated and use free assets if I want them to be able to follow along. But then if it's something that's just a generic example, I would try to make it as unopinionated as possible.
This question kills me. So I've so much conflict with this. Here's the personal internal struggle I've had my whole life with this stuff. So people know me for making tutorial material, but I cannot stress enough, I am probably the person who watches or consumes the most educational or tutorial material than anyone you know. I literally watch hundreds and hundreds of hours of content all of the time. Like I have a Pluralsight subscription for 10 years at this stage. And because I watch stuff at 3x speed, I watch a lot of content. And to your point, I have the exact same journey that people now approach me with, which is I keep hearing phrases like, I want to see real examples. I want to see examples in a game. I want projects where I can, really learn how to do things. And then I remembered back to myself going, I kept saying that because I kept consuming lots and lots of stuff. And you kept finding these like one-off scripts that would show you, to your point, there's like 5 million ways to start a lobby, but there's nothing past starting a lobby. And that tended to get very frustrating. But then there's the other side of the coin where even myself, and it's one of those uncomfortable truths. When I go back looking for scripts, if I think about a project where someone has a zipped project or a GitHub repo of something, the idea of going, oh yeah, they did an example, I kind of feel exhausted of, okay, I'm going to have to pull down the Git project, open it, wait for Unity to open, go through the stuff, have a look at the stuff, and figure out the bits that are relevant to me. And then, like you said, they're often very opinionated to how that person likes to do stuff. In contrast, there are some developers, Scott Game Sounds is one, Speed Shooter's another, where they just put a script in a text file on a website. And I remember when I first started, I used to look at that and go, ugh, that's not the right way to do things. They're just small text files. They're not systems. They don't really do a lot of things or whatever. And truthfully, I wouldn't use most of their scripts for anything because they are those prototype quick tutorials. But when I want to recap or learn something, they're the ones I go to because I know there's going to be the 5 lines I need somewhere in that script that does the thing. It's not how I would do it, but it's all the information I would need to figure out how I would do it for my own system. So long story short, the eternal personal conflict is I keep saying I want more complicated examples, but every time I get a complicated example, nobody's there to point out why it's complicated or what the value of all the complication is. And I find normally it's much easier for me to take a simple example with just a few lines, learn it, and then learn how to make my own systems and then make it complicated myself. So in truth, when it comes to that sort of opinionated systems, I struggle with this because I know a lot of esoteric syntax. I know the amount of times I write code and someone's like, I didn't know that symbol was in Unity, or I didn't know you could do that particular thing. And it's like, well, now I can't really share my stuff if I constantly have to keep guarding against, like, am I using obscure, syntax in C#? So yeah, I try to simplify my stuff when I release it to just like, can I distill an idea down to a script? Even if I wouldn't make it a mono behavior, because realistically it doesn't need to be mono behavior, it doesn't need all the functions from Unity. Maybe I'll just make it a mono behavior because it's easy to prove the point, drop it on a project, press play, see it work. And then if someone wanted to quote unquote do it right, they could cut the pieces out and put it into something else.
Yeah, they could add in that extra layer there pretty easily. Yeah, and I mean, as Sovereign's got a point there, kind of like seeing the opinions of the educator and just decide if they kind of like that or not. And I mean, I think that often there's a lot of value in that, like seeing how people do things. And I do like going through educational content where I'll see people put together a full project and see how they did like to architect and design things. But when I'm trying to learn a new bit of technology and not the architecture side, a lot of the time I feel like that eats up a lot of what's going on and a lot of my brain power trying to figure out like how they built these things and where all these layers are and how they tie together. I feel like that can be confusing, and especially if you're coming in a little bit newer, because you get the idea that, oh, this is the way that this has to be built, when really it's 20% is the kind of core part of how the systems work for whatever thing it is that you're trying to learn, and then the other part,
I think it's when they don't focus on it, because to your point, I think you're right, is that Pluralsight was really good at this in the early days, where there was about 8 different entire multi-hour series on how to do a REST API. And at the time I was working in web, and so I did a lot of research into AWS and Azure and databases and EDO.NET and all of the stuff related to that area. And there was 3 different tutors who are all Microsoft certified tutors who approach things vastly differently. And it was very fascinating because I could watch it and go, oh, they like returning REST API calls with a path URL that evaluates to the entity type. They like to use the specific patch document stuff that allows for it. And so each one does different things. But I think, again, to your point, they didn't focus on the architecture. They taught you a thing. And in the process, you're like, they're doing it differently than that guy did it. And you can kind of connect the dots to yourself and try out different things, see how they work. I think if they stopped and made it about the architecture in those kind of learning videos, I would have equally have gotten confused and lost,
Yeah. I feel like I definitely got lost a couple times starting out. So I don't know if anybody in chat has any questions too. Feel free to just pop them up and or put them in there, and we'll pop them up. But yeah, that was just one of the things that was kind of on my mind. I was thinking about it, like I said, because we were talking about it before the show. But I'm curious, what's new with you, Greg? What's going on with the game?
Well, the game is out. It's released. It's not selling very well. I suspended the Performance Max campaign I had going on Google Ads because it just wasn't giving me any results. I still have a couple of app campaigns for the mobile versions, but they don't. I only would get charged for actual conversions for those. So if they're not doing anything for me, I don't get charged anything. So I just kept them running. But getting back to the topic we were just talking about, one of the reasons I like to do complete game tutorials, like how to make a full game from scratch, is I've heard people talk about tutorial hell, where like Jason was talking about when he said his journey, he would learn how to make a lobby, but you don't really see how to go beyond that. And so I want people to be able to see how you can make a whole game from scratch, everything, how you handle input, how you handle all the game mechanics, how you keep score, how you save high scores, restart the game, all the different things, and even how to publish it. to different platforms. And so that's why I like to focus on course length, what I call course length tutorials.
I keep trying that, but I can't do it. I'll give you an example. I tried to do it. So somebody said to me, just start a project the way you would and talk through what you're doing. And I said, okay, that's a good way to approach this. Don't overthink all this stuff. I'll just start doing it the way I do. And every time it's something that I think is worth mentioning, I'll mention it. 3 hours went by and we were still setting up the initial Git repository because I kept stopping and going, okay, do you know do you know how Git works? Okay, well, let's talk about the fact that Git's a tree structure. I said, well, are you comfortable with like setting up do you know you can use multiple git ignore files and why that's relevant? I said, okay, well, how about the fact that if you wanted to fix issues with this, do you know how hashes work? Okay, so do you know what a hash is? And if you know what a hash is, we can then talk about SHA1. If you know SHA1, we can talk about how Git uses it. Then do you know about how to verify contents of files using the cat object file stuff? And then that's just like setting all this up. And then by the time we're done, we're like, okay, so this is why I set up a folder structure which starts with this, has a documents folder, has this, whatever. Now we'll start the Unity project. We start the Unity project, and then it goes down to, okay, first thing I do was open up the manifest.json file and do so. I was like, why did you do that? Okay, well, okay. And so again, by the time we got to the point where it was just an empty Unity project, default URP thing, we were 2 or 3 hours in and kind of exhausted. And so the more I think about the idea of doing that, like if we get to a save system, there is 500 considerations from, like, if I was just doing it myself, sure, I would just write the code and be done with it. But that's not the question. The question is, why did you choose to do it this way? And it comes down to, okay, well, what is serialization? Why do you serialize things? How are you reading the data in? What types of data get read in different ways? Which stuff is config data? Which stuff needs to be cached? Which stuff is large entity based stuff that would be better off with JSON lines rather than JSON? How do you do your boundary line for your presentation layer to your persistence? And it's like, by the time I'm done, just so much stuff goes through that it's because there isn't a set path. It's like, how do you condense just picking stuff up for 20 years, right? You can't really put it into one single thing. So yeah, I've found it really hard to just make it like, here's how I would do it, because the amount of, every time I've tried to just skip over that stuff, somebody pauses and goes, well, what about that? It's like, okay, well, because the institutional knowledge is very hard to get across,
Yeah, I guess I don't go into that much detail as to like why I'm doing this. I do give kind of a high level detail. Like when I was doing it might have been the Defender series, but I explained why I was making my input system the way I was and abstracting the input with an interface because I wanted to be able to use the same. It was the Joust tutorial. That's what it was. And I wanted to use the same bird mover for the player's bird and for the enemy's bird. And the only difference would be where the input's coming from. You're flapping or you're running. It doesn't matter whether it's a human moving the control stick or if it's the AI saying, I want to flap, I want to move. And I got feedback. People couldn't understand why I was adding this extra layer of abstraction. And so then I had a whole new video where I just dove into that topic. And here's why I abstract my input this way. So I guess I gave more of a high level overview of here's how you can make this complete game from scratch. And then if people have questions about specifics, I can follow it up with a more detailed explanation for that.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of the time too, it's good to teach the things when they're being used and like talk about them. Like for story, your kind of example, I feel probably 75% of the Git stuff could be talked about later on as you're actually needing to use those things and as they kind of come up. And maybe it's just me, but I feel like it makes it a lot easier for me to retain stuff when I like see the problem first and then see the solution instead of seeing the solution without seeing the problem. Like I gotta like see like, okay, here's like this happens and then this is how we fix it and this is kind of why we use this solution. And I feel like maybe with Git stuff, it's also very easy to just start getting into like
but the problem I have is the why question, right?
Yeah.
Like, for example, you could just say, okay, let's start by setting up Git and setting up a Git attributes file. It's like, what's a Git attribute file? Well, it's because if you're using LFS, you want to define what's tracked. Okay, well, why do you need Git LFS? Well, at some point we're going to add large files. Well, what do you mean large files? Well, see, the way Git works, it uses text assets, and you don't want to start. So again, it's this like, it's not just a start.
That, so you go like, okay, we're going to set up Git, and then when we're ready to add the large files, we're going to add large files. Now we're going to commit these large files. Now let's get back into Git LFS. So we have the problem. Like if you, I'm obviously just thinking off the top of my head, you got me kind of inspired thinking about this stuff. But yeah, I feel like you gotta. It is difficult to not do it. So like resist the urge to just,
especially because it's like it's in every aspect. Like I use the Git one because it was kind of it's a complicated starting point. But the other one is just like we talked about on the other one with. Okay, I start my Unity project, and the first thing I do is make a file called entry.cs. And I was like, well, why do you do that? Because I want an entry point for my application. And then you kind of go through the whole process of, well, why do you need that right now? It's like, well, technically I don't, but it makes more sense if I have some kind of root system for other. And so even those, like it comes down to, I find that the discussion around why is the most important part. Like I can give you 4 lines of code, but if you copy the 4 lines of code, it's not going to do anything for you. Like the reason why it's valuable is those eureka moments of like, aha, that's why you approach it this way. And I find that I feel like I'd be doing a disservice if I just follow along where I'm going, because the benefit of doing that would be I do it this way because of these 15 reasons. And if you come to different conclusions than me, that's fine. But I want to give you the 15 bits of information that I use to get to that conclusion, so you can decide if you want to take a different route. But if I just give you the answer, the presumption is I'm right because ... I said so, which I don't like doing. I like to always say I came to this conclusion because this, and this. If your situation is different, do something different.
Yeah, I think that's super important, because a lot of the time people will teach things, and they're just teaching it because a way that just happens to be convenient at the moment for no reason at all, or it's just unrelated, and there's not kind of getting that point across. So I don't know. I don't have a whole lot more to add to this, but I don't know if you guys do.
Now, I was wondering, since we all do content creation, have you seen the new Elgato teleprompter that's coming out? It's basically an external monitor that's a teleprompter, and you can put anything on it. Like it's great for something like this where we're streaming and you want to see the chat, or just for like at work, if you're on Zoom, you can have their faces up on your teleprompter, so you have perfect eye contact with the person you're talking to. It looks really cool.
Oh, it does. It does look kind of cool. I have not seen this before. I had a pop it up on screen. I had a teleprompter set up. Actually, I still have it somewhere, but it runs off of like a tablet. This looks like
that's what I have. I have the Parrot Caster. It does the off the phone, which does the job.
Yeah,
I actually don't like I understand the idea of a second monitor version, which is kind of cool, but I do find that I just don't like having to then manage the other monitor, especially with things like OBS and different stuff. But I will admit that particular part's quite nice, where if I have my script and I'm looking down the lens, I have done that once or twice where I have actually set it up to be the camera on like a Zoom call. I mean, able to like look at the person when you're talking is very cool. That is a nice addition. I can see the value in doing that.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's pretty cool. It looks a little pricey.
I would just say, yeah, exactly. Though for that price, you can get something called the Parrot prompter, which is like 50 or 60. You can get any old mobile phone you have lying around and stick it onto that thing, and it does the same job. And there's also software that'll let you cast to it. It'll be delayed, but if you're using it as a prompter, you don't need it to be perfectly accurate. You just need it to be, timed in a way that you can read it. So there's ways around it, but it's a cool product. I like that they're making it. It didn't inspire me to pick one up.
Padcaster.
The Parrot one, right, is one you use? Oh, you're muted, Story. I don't know what happened. You got silent.
So I see Padcaster Parrot Pro teleprompter.
That's the one.
Kit.
That's the one.
Right. Yeah. So there's a small one, and then there's a big one. And I feel like it's easier to do it on the smaller one. It's easier to not move your eyes around if you're trying to read it. Like the big ones make it a little bit weird. Like your eyes are scanning across past the camera constantly.
And I assume that mount, you could use that with a like a Razer Kiyo Ring camera.
I would assume so.
Should be able
I don't
to.
know.
Yeah.
I put it so the way that the Parrot one works, you pop your camera, it goes like on top of the tripod, and then the phone sits there. It has a little reflecting mirror screen, and then your camera sits basically on top of that. It has like another mount for like the tripod would have. So as long as it mounts on a tripod and it fits, I would assume it's good. But it's like another layer that just kind of goes in between the tripod and the camera. They're pretty handy. Why not just? Yeah, here's a good question. So this actually came up earlier. We were talking about this about source control options in Unity's stuff. So why do you use Git instead of something like Unity's built-in source control system story?
Oh, that's a long one. I actually did try back when it was collab and it was the simpler integrated version. I did use that a lot as like a starting simple get started portion of the project. But I find that realistically, like a couple of small details. For example, if you're working on a shared project with people who are contractors, if you use Unity system, you have to add them to your organization to give them access to modify the code, which is insane because I might have 15 clients throughout the course of a year who are all different companies doing different stuff, and I'm not going to add them all to my company, and also I don't want to get added to each of their companies and have to deal with a whole mass of custom emails and stuff. So it's impractical from that perspective. Second, there's vendor lock issues where if you are using a system like that, you are entirely tied in to their storage solution. So if they up or down their pricing, you're SOL, as they say. And so there's a lot of other issues with that too in terms of usability. If you're working with teams of other people, oftentimes you come across, for example, artists may not be familiar with, like a lot of people haven't even heard of plastic unless you're in the programming space. So now you've got a whole issue of training.
Game dev side, because even outside of that, most people haven't heard of it.
Like Git may be confusing at first, but the difference is if you don't know Git, you can install Turtis SVN, which will give you a right-click option in your operating system to do it, or you can install GitHub Desktop, which will do half the magic for you, or you can source free, or yeah, there's
Git extensions.
tutorials. Exactly, there's tutorials, there's plugins. VS Code will do it natively, so the ubiquity of it is just an outstanding benefit. And then separately from all of that is the actual philosophy of what Git does that's different. Is all of the other ones tend to have some sort of a localized upstream with locks. That's their sales pitch. You can lock certain things or you can handle it from a single repository. The reason Git works is that a lot of people don't realize that the remotes are just someone else's computer. You can literally do peer-to-peer Git. You don't need a remote of any kind. You can just have 3 computers connected to each other as each other's remotes. You can do it whichever way you like. There's a standard that GitHub has provided because they have hooks and plugins and all the other fun stuff.
Do you ever do that?
No.
Okay. I just wanted to check because I know I've heard people talk about it. I've never known anybody who actually had a real scenario where they didn't just have a remote Git repo that they used.
Yeah, we live in a world where GitHub and GitLab are cheap, easy to access, standardized, and whatever else. And not to mention, the other reason is if you are using a remote that's a common one, like GitHub Desktop or GitLab or whatever, and you use any CI/CD platform or anything similar, they often have a magic connect to GitHub, abracadabra your stuff together, and it works button, which is very nice. The alternative is you do the Unity version. You're like, okay, now go to Unity and get a passcode and come to here and put the passcode in here and create a config file and map the config file to the API call to the. It's like, why give yourself the headache when most things work? And more people are going to have configurations and defaults and tools. The fact that you can type in git ignore Unity and just get one for free on GitHub is kind of the point. There's a lot more resources in and around it. And all of that aside, there's simply more tools. GitHub has been used on more things for more projects that we briefly touched on it here. There's things called Git bisect. A lot of people don't realize, which basically is saying my application broke. I don't know where. So you can pick a commit that's in the past where it worked, take the current commit, which doesn't work, and then say bisect good or bad. And it will literally divide every time and help you find which commit caused the break. Like it's got features like that that people don't even realize are there. So yeah, it's a very, very powerful tool that's designed for that job, and it's open source. Like it's free. It's like why would I use anything else? Is really the question from my perspective. You know.
Yeah, so I've used Plastic. I've used GitHub, GitLab. And the reason I settle on GitLab now is for my tutorials, since I like to share my code, I can just make it a public repo and I can put that link in my YouTube video description and anybody can access it. So yeah, it's just really convenient for that. And it does work really well with the CI/CD pipeline. I've even had it work smoother on Unity Cloud Build than their built-in source control. I don't know why I had trouble with it pulling my repo sometimes, and never had that issue with GitLab.
Plus, again, there's Git hooks. Like you can find a million there's plugins for Git that let you write Git hooks using JavaScript to then make JavaScript configurations that will then allow for more hooks. So again, like because Git isn't like a Unity thing; it's a software thing. There's so much resources for it.
Well, case in point, I use Hack and Plan, and I can put a little HNP colon in my check-in comment, and it will link it to the story or the bug in Hack and Plan for me. And so if I go into Hack and Plan and I look at that story and it'll show me the commit history for that story, and I click on it, it'll take me right to the code.
And again, and GitHub will do that as well for people who don't use it. Like people talk about using Trello and other tools for project management. You can do all of that in GitHub. GitHub literally has an entire task. Now I don't, but it's doable. Like there's all that stuff is there, and if you do use it, same thing. It'll automatically. You can literally make a commit which has an ID tied to a bug, and it will close the bug on commit of that particular piece of code. You don't have to write anything to do any of the modification. And then again, if you have a Git hook which does your testing, you've now got an entire pipeline which says someone logs a bug to it. You can have your Slack or Discord channel get a ping that it arrived. You can make some code fix, type the ID and push it, which fixes the bug, which marks it as complete, which runs the test suite, which does the thing. Like yeah, there's just
you can do all that with Azure DevOps too.
Yeah, and I just want to point out for anybody, if you're not going to learn Git and you're not going to spend the time, you should still at least use the built-in version control. And if you're just trying to figure out, you don't even know what version control is, start with the built-in one. Once you get familiar with it, just you can learn Git. You'll get the extra stuff, but until you do it, it might be a little bit confusing if you've never touched any version control and don't have any help. It can be a little bit scary. Make sure you back
yourself up.
Yeah.
Like, honestly, there was years where I was very freaked out about Git, but the two most important things I think to note is I cannot stress this enough. I think Git is the single most magical thing in all of software development from a practical standpoint. There is nothing else that gives you so much value for so little cost in terms of learning it and use. And it's not about code. You could be a student doing Word documents for your college projects, and understanding Git will allow you to have infinite control over rewinding time and managing your projects and all of that stuff. And again, something that I don't think people realize, when you download a Git project, you're not just downloading the project, you're downloading time itself. That .git folder, that directory inside of the project, isn't just the project. It is every alternate timeline and branch and variation of that project throughout its lifetime. So if you're trying to download something to learn from, people are talking about having a finished project. If you download a Git project, you get the empty project all the way up to the finished project. And if the person did their job correctly, by the way, check out my GitHub where I've split it up in the different phases, you can rewind time to each decision I make, what I did, and see the code that I added and watch the project build up. So from an educational perspective, that's really useful. There's just so many different benefits of having different branches of different stuff. It's like a lot of source control requires you to have a connection to some server somewhere, but you can download the entire Git repository onto a file and have 10 years worth of every decision everyone ever made across that project, which is mind-blowing. With one exception, which is if you're using Git LFS, a lot of people don't realize that cache isn't included. If you're about to go on an airplane with your Git repo and you're using LFS, you will not be able to pull down the older, more obscure commits unless you also run the Git LFS caching command to pull the stuff down first. But that's very niche edge case.
That's like the whole point of LFS, right?
Yes.
It's so you don't end up with a giant copy. And for anybody who, if you're new to Git stuff and you decide to start using it in your Unity or game projects, make sure that you spend some time, understand LFS, which is it for a large file system, and that stands for, which
Large
is
file
really
support, I think.
or large file support. Yeah. So it's to handle giant big files, because if you've got art files, then you maybe got maybe your designer
PSCs.
drew in a 1 gig texture and then they're modifying it constantly. You don't want to have multiple 1 gig, multiple versions of it, every single one, 20 different versions of it on all of your systems, because Git will store every copy of stuff. LFS kind of allows you to specify files that you don't store every copy of, essentially. Yeah. So I saw this comment here by Brian that you don't know you need version control until you need version control. This is so true. You don't realize how important it is until you screwed up and forgot to commit things for a while, and then suddenly something went wrong and you can't get your code. It has happened to me before. I've lost a week's worth of work. I was like, I'll commit it later. I don't want to check it in. I'll do it later. I don't want to do it, because the system was kind of a pain in the ass to work with. And oh man, it's horrible.
Well,
I'm sure
the thing for me is it. Oddly enough, it wasn't software that made me hard sold on Git, because I spent 5 years as a software developer. You just use Git because they tell you to. But when they say use Git, it's press the magic Git button to pull the project down. It's not. I'm not engaging with it as a platform. To me, it's just the place the code lives. It's the magic code button that gets me the updated code. But the bit that sold me on it was actually documentation. That's kind of what I was saying earlier about college projects and stuff. When you can use, say, an Obsidian repository of just text notes, and you can decide to write a story for your game or come up with game mechanics you like, you can say you can write a whole pile of paragraphs, interconnected documents, and go, you know what? Maybe what if I turn my game into a battle royale? So you can stop for a second. You can rewind time. You can then make a literal branch called "Imagine my game was like this," and then make an entire suite of other documentation and stuff and ideas and whatever. And being able to do that, where you pull up a folder full of notes, and then just type in different words saying, Git switch first person shooter, Git switch top down shooter, Git switch golfing game, and you can see all of your notes swap and change relative to the different things. And then when you decide on settling on something, you just merge all into one and go, the actual project I've settled on, or go back into the past and cherry pick a particular commit and then pull it up to the top again. So being able to think about your text information, you're and again, I'm somebody who has 1,000,001 bookmarks and links and websites, and I keep resources to stuff, and I type down quotes from people of different stuff I like. That's where it's really powerful. You can manage your information in an insanely powerful way, where again, you're encapsulating time itself. It's like time control. That's how cool is that as a concept,
Well, Jason Weimann, you were really good in your mastery course of committing after every little segment. You were committing your changes. That's good to get that ingrained in the students.
Yeah, I'm a big fan, and I was just putting a poll of this up here, of committing constantly. So I'm curious how often everybody else does. So I learned this lesson a long time ago when things broke, and I've had hardware failures happen multiple times over the years. I've had just stupid mistakes, and kids come up and hit a button, or I hit a button and delete the wrong thing, accidentally delete an entire project, meaning to delete a different copy of it. So now I commit constantly. It's make a change, commit, make a change, commit. As soon as it works, I just kind of commit. I was curious how often you guys do, and everybody in chat. I just threw a poll up in the chat. It looks like everybody's so far. Okay, every day, every change. It's 56% of people so far.
I cannot stress this enough. Daily is not enough, people. Please, that is the wrong answer to that question. You have to think of it imagine you're playing Baldur's Gate, and every conversation might be relevant. We all know we're pressing the save button before every valuable conversation. Well, your project should hopefully be more valuable to you than your decision in Baldur's Gate. You should be saving with the same frequency of you thinking that a decision is important, because you can do things called squashes. You can make it smaller. You can squish stuff. What you should be doing is a commit before you do something that might break things, after things might have broken, and after you think it works. So basically, sit down to decide on a feature, make a commit, start working on it, think it's okay, make a commit, test that it does what you want. Either if it doesn't, make a commit, go back and do something else, or if it does, keep
Revert it.
going. Yeah.
Backing up my master's degree project.
Well, one
Yeah.
time when I was compiling at work, this is back writing in C and DOS, the command line compiler, and I had one of those little dumbbells, little like 10-pound dumbbell or something, and I accidentally hit the bottom of my desk, and my desktop was on top of the desk, so the computer jumped, and the hard drive skipped, and it mangled my hard drive. I mean,
That kills a hard
because
drive.
it was in the
yeah,
process
that's
of
it.
writing. And all of a sudden, I started getting all these disk errors and stuff, and I was like, "Oh no!"
That's why you can't work out if you're doing software development. It's too dangerous.
Yeah. The one I'll never forget is specifically, I was surprisingly to nobody, the tech guy in college, and people used to come to me with their tech problems. And there was one stage, one of the girls in the nursing course had her like final year thesis project, and so I just hear like a sad knock on my door, and I see 15 girls standing in the hallway holding a USB key that's bent literally in half with like tears streaming down her face, and go, "Is there anything you can do with this?" And I was just like, I don't know what to tell you. Like I did have a look, and no, obviously it didn't connect, and it's just like there was no backups, there was no nothing, and it's like that's it. That's like I think she said 9 months of work is just gone, and like now she has to go and talk to various different people in the course and get referrals and get sort of thing. And again, like it's one of those things. If it happens to you once, it probably won't ever happen to you again, because you'll have learned never to get in that situation again. But I don't think that's the right lesson. I think people look at source control as that, like the magic undo button. But again, I go back to why treat it as just the one-time save? If you could press a button that would let you save yourself so that if something happened, you could rewind yourself back to a previous point in time, I'm pretty sure nobody would go, "I'll just press it once and we'll be fine." You're going to be pressing that button every time something good or bad happens to you. It's like perpetually for the rest of your life. And so your project shouldn't be a one-time commit. It should be thought of as, what if somebody comes along later and says, "I really like this project, but it's too confusing for me." And you're like, "Oh, cool. I can rewind it back to just before I added the complex stuff and explain that to you." Or, "That project's really cool, but what if you added this mechanic?" It's like, I don't want to mess with the current system because it doesn't work. I can go rewind back, make another branch, and then test a new theory out in a different direction. There's a million and one reasons why you'd want to do that. And when you go to debug things later, if something goes wrong and you look at a commit and the commit's got 3 files in it, it's so much easier. The amount of times I see Unity projects where you make 2-line changes, which modifies a bunch of stuff in Unity, which rebuilds 50 files, which then modifies the editor settings directory, which modifies a whole bunch of stuff or whatever, and then you're committing 60 files and go, "Stuff happened." And so you'll never be able to find stuff happened again. You won't know what was in it. And if you try to undo that, you're not just undoing the 3 things you did, you're undoing a whole sea of complicated stuff that's going on, and it's impossible to fix and find. If you understand smaller commits, and then even better than that, there's something called patch adds, which are a whole different conversation, which is even better. If you do that, you can commit parts of files. Like imagine in a world with Unity where you could move a bunch of objects around in your scene and then literally decide to only commit certain objects, rotations, and position changes, like in the scene. You could say, actually, I don't want to change that portion of that object in that scene. Like you can get really granular with this, but you don't have to. All I'm saying is at a very basic level, just treat it like every editor you have has a button for this. There's a shortcut in Writer, there's a shortcut in Visual Studio. Even if you don't do the nice named, subtly divided thing, just get into the habit of pressing it with the same level of frequency you press Control S in Unity. Just get into the habit of committing it regularly, just to give yourself that freedom. Because it's free. Like legitimately, it is infinitely free magic undo ability. It doesn't take up space, doesn't cost you anything. It's free magic. I don't understand why people don't use free magic all of the time.
Yeah. Can you clarify that just a little bit, though? When you said every time you hit save, do you commit non-working stuff, or do you make sure that it's working before you commit things?
So that's one of those, yeah.
Not in a working state, mark and know that it's like a work in progress or something. How do you go about that? Because it sounds like you're like just committing as you're going along, but then you may have too many points and not really know where to go back to. But
Well,
I
I
think
actually
that's actually the case. So I just want to get that clarified.
well, I use something called conventional commits, which is just if you've heard of Semver or semantic versioning, like, well, again, this goes back to the tangent on a tangent. It's worth knowing what Semver is before you go down this road, which is whenever you see a version number on a piece of software, so 10.05.01, that's not just arbitrarily made up. You'll see a lot of kind of new game devs who just go, this feels like an 8 to me, so I'm going to put an 8 there on that one, and it makes it a bit higher up a number. But those numbers mean something. Each one is meant to represent whether or not your project has small version changes, large version changes, or release changes. And then there's hotfix versions and whatever else. So my point is you're encoding information in that number. And in your Git commits, you can do the same thing. I use a very simple prefix structure of fix, clean, chore, setup, add, feature, a few others. And so I can just quickly scan through it. I don't use the automatic dot version. I will literally add files as I go. So I tend to commit in 2s and 3s of small files normally. Not always the case, but I do aim to do that on system design especially. And that way, when I look at it, it's my general rule is chore is something I added to the project which doesn't make it to the end product. So anything I add that isn't a feature that's displayed to the user, well, feature is a feature that gets added. So I just go through the thing, and you're able to look at my code and go, here is where I set up the project. Then I wrote documentation because it says docs. Then I started a feature and I said feature this. Then I added a chore, which is I fixed a few things or added a few different like install packages. Then I did a bug fix because it says fix followed by whatever. Then I modified the feature. And so you'll be able to scan very quickly and go, I want to see this project before that feature was added. Scroll for the word FEAT in front of a thing, click that one, undoes all the way back to that point. So to answer your question about do I commit broken code? Yes, I'll happily do that because, again, it doesn't cost me anything to commit something with a label, and I can just ignore it next time, or I can remove it, or later on you can squash them into one commit, so it's a single fixed version by the time you go to something else. So, it's a whole different tangent, but same with branches, right? I don't want to go on a whole big rant about this.
So
I was going to ask if you want to talk about branching strategy.
Real quick, when we're on this, because we're talking about this commit strategy, these are commits that are local commits, and I assume you're not pushing those though until it's in a solid state. Or if you are pushing them, they're to a
I think you should only push about 3 times a day, or maybe twice a day, or even once a day sometimes, depending, because you have a lot of freedom. There's a thing called you can use a tool for Git rebase-i. And -i stands for interactive. And what that does is it gives you you have to know a bit of Vim, so it gets a bit confusing. But if you do know what you're doing, it lists all of the commits you have made. And what you can do is it has a keyword in front of it. The keyword is like fix, squash, whatever. There's different keywords. And what you can do is you can basically say, take these 4, rename it to this, take these 5, give it this name, actually skip that one, include these 2. And then when you're done, you have a like nicer history, and you push that history up to the master version for everybody else to use, you know.
Yeah, but I just want to clarify, anybody who's seeing it, like they don't start committing partial things into their repo and pushing that up and breaking the build and setting off the little red fire alarms and stuff. That
if you've got automated stuff, to be clear, and this goes back to we can talk about branching in a sec, but like if there is an automated system that runs tests, I'm not going to try to commit to something that actively has an entire spooled up machine to run a build on. But if I'm committing locally, I'm checkpointing as often as possible, because sometimes you'll do something, it'll break, but the idea might be good. You won't be like, I'm kind of on the right track, but I couldn't get it to work. So you'll undo it back. You'll do the other version, but you can always just reference what you were thinking in the wrong version or the refactoring you're doing, and then just leave it there. And if you want to get rid of it, then just like you can get rid of it later. It doesn't. There's no downside to making commit. Nothing gets harmed. Nothing gets deleted. Unlike every other type of system, commits are just free additional backups. There's zero downside to them. You know.
Well, I think you've removed the cost for yourself by using some good naming conventions too, though, because the one cost is the clutter of seeing all those commits. But if you actually make naming conventions for them and make it easy for you to find things, you're going to make it quite a bit simpler. I was just picturing this giant list of commits, and I think the other thing that's really important to mention too is how vital it is to have good commit messages that actually explain things. And one of the reasons doing those big bundled commits is terrible is because it's nearly impossible to remember what's actually in a commit if it's 4, 5, 6 hours of work. You got all this stuff in here. You're going to remember like the top 1 or 2 things in there and then forget all of the other things that are in there. And
I also think like it's just a good educational tool. Like I know a lot of people who are just like, I don't understand what Unity's doing. Like I change 2 words. I put a comment in my code and I go back to Unity and it starts recompiling stuff. And I'm like, I have no idea what Unity did. It's like, well, you can find out. Just open up GitHub desktop, look at the file changes. You can see every single thing that has been changed in that time period. And so sometimes I'll look at that and go, oh, I can literally see it modified the modification date in the meta file and whatever else. So you just get more uncomfortable with Unity as an engine or any other piece of software with generative code if you just stop from time to time, read what changes happened, and get to know how the system is behind the scenes saving out its data.
Cool. Greg, you got any other thoughts on this? Anybody got any other questions in chat too? With that,
I wanted to hear Jason's branching strategy. Like, you talk about being able to see all your stages. Like when you put something up on GitHub, you want people to be able to follow the stages. Are you doing that through branches or tags, or how are you doing
that? So this is, like I said earlier, remember I said there was like, I went down a 3-hour rabbit hole on Git. This is why, because this specific, to answer this question, I feel like it's worth knowing what Git does and how it works. Because why I make that decision is predicated on that setup. So there's a lot of debate around Git branching. There's Git flow, GitHub flow, there's trunk-based and whatever, and they all have different philosophies based on different stuff. But what's kind of silly and frustrating at the same time is, so broadly speaking, the way that Git works is no matter what file you give it, it runs a hashing algorithm against the file. It takes the whole bytes of that file and abracadabras, and you end up with a text file. So it's just a single string of characters. And then if you literally open the .git folder and open the objects folder, there'll be a folder called E5, and then E5 will be the first 2 characters of that hash, and then the rest of it is the name of the file. So literally, if you understand the hash, you can actually like open the file and edit it inside the .git Obsidian folder, or what the folder for it. Anyway, all of this is to say, it's all hash based. And if you look at visualizers that show you how a Git repository works, here's the mind-blowing bit from my perspective. There is a single hash for every file and every version change of that file. And then there's a hash for something called a tree, which just points to a collection of files. And then there's a hash for a commit, which points to a tree, which points to a collection of files. So literally every concept in Git is encapsulated in a file that you can literally open and literally look at. And everything except for your data is about 3 lines in a file. A commit is literally 3 lines in a text file. It just happens to have a fancy number. That's it. And a branch is the same thing. Every single aspect of it is. All of that's to say, what is a branch? A branch is a file that you can open up in Visual Studio Code with a single number in it, which is a number that points to a commit. So if you wanted to make a branch and not go through the whole Git solution, you could open the head folder, go to the branches, copy the file, give it a different name, paste a different commit number in it, and you've made a new branch. So all of this is to say, people talk about, because it looks complicated, a branch looks like this systemic large network. It must be doing, it literally is an arrow that points to a place. Mm-hmm. The tree exists when you make all the commits, and a branch is just that one, or actually that one there. And if you change a branch, it's like, well, actually this branch branches off here. Well, that means that the code branched off here, and I'm pointing at that one now. That's all it is. So when you realize that, it's kind of very hard for me to care as much about all of the like long meandering conversations about should I have 1 branch or 2 branches or 10 branches. I'm like, point to 50 things if you like, or point to 1. I don't care, because the beauty of Git is the information is there, it's in it, it's built, it works, and all the arrows are for semantic helpfulness. To answer the specifics of what I choose to do, I make branches as is relevant to the use cases I have. And what I mean by that is if I'm doing regular nightly builds, I make a branch with which to do that on. So it makes sense to call release branch. If I'm making a branch to test a feature, I might make a branch for a feature. I don't traditionally follow a specific branching structure. If I was to align with one of them, I would say GitHub flow is the closest to how I do stuff. But the truth is, it really comes down to, you can literally spin up a branch whenever you want, do what you like, and delete it. And literally all you've done is delete a single file with a number in it. That's all it is, in all the complexity behind it.
So for like when I do a tutorial series, like my 3D space shooter, there's probably 17 different chapters in that. I have a separate branch for each one. So people following along, if they want to just, for like part 5, they can just download they can check out branch 5, part 5. So I didn't know since you mentioned you have stages and you want people to see the stages I didn't know if you were talking about something similar. And I know some people would just tag a particular revision and you can just
So here's a question for you. What's the difference between a tag and a branch?
Well, under the covers, probably not much.
Well, actually, yeah. So there's two types of tags. There's called lightweight tags and there's annotated tags. A lightweight tag and a branch is exactly the same thing. Like the file is the same file. It's just in a different folder located on the directory. So what is a tag? It is a pointer. It is a single file with a single hash that points to a location. It just looks different in the visual rendering of how you do it. The annotated tags are that plus the message you associated with it. So arguably a tag, an annotated tag, is just a branch with a name. Basically, It's the same thing, or a description paragraph. So.
Well, I saw somebody was asking about things that don't merge well, and I remember Jason Weimann, you did a video,
years ago. That was like 6 years ago or something on your YAML merge.
Tend to not merge very well, and your solution to that was to use prefabs, make all your changes in a prefab because they merge a lot better.
Yes. Yeah, I'd use that. Use the scene merge tool too, which helps sometimes. It helps a lot of the time if it's not too bad. Also, in separating scenes out into just multiple scenes, like a lot of the time, that's the easiest solution, splitting out the scene. Because a lot of the time, the people that are stomping on each other's changes are slightly different disciplines, and they can be in a split up set of scenes. It's very rare that like two designers are going in the same time and breaking stuff, or two environment artists are working on the same part and breaking it and stomping on each other's changes. There was a question here about how you deal with non-code changes in Git. Aside from obviously using LFS for those big art files, do you have a different strategy? Do you commit these files separately? You're like, hey, here's an art commit, or how do you? I mean, generally what I do is I pull in whatever art I'm going to do, and then I make a commit of just that art, and then I'll start using it. And then I commit that totally separate in whatever I'm going to do it in, whatever system it is. But do you guys do the same, or do you just pull it in and then commit it all at once? Or, I mean, do you commit each art file individually, Story?
No, I'm not that particular, but basically... So it's the same thing as we had this discussion about code before in terms of where do you order your methods or your fields or whatever. My answer always comes down to, why am I doing this? There's two reasons to use commits. One is the magic, oh my God, this might break button. And the second one is information. I either want to come back to it or change stuff or whatever. And so I will make a commit in one of two scenarios. Either this is about to be scary, this is about to change the project in a meaningful way, or this is something that is informationally useful to somebody. Like, for example, if I pulled in the TextMesh Pro asset and I'm about to configure it, I will make a commit before I configure it. So I have the version as you would have gotten had you pulled it down, then the version after I've modified what it is. And so I don't commit types of assets per se. To me, just like with Git, it's all binary, or it's all bytes at some end of the spectrum, and it's all text. So I think of it in terms of this collection of text. Scenes are text. Prefabs are text. It's all text. So I just commit text in various configurations as per the is this a feature? Does it modify the project? Does it add something new for someone to play with? Does it break something? Does it move things around in a way that people might care about? Will people care, or will I be afraid of it breaking? I just make commits on that metric.
Yeah, just whatever related content is part of that work, that will be in the same commit. So I'm not segregating it by art, music, code, whatever.
Okay. Yeah, and on that topic of tags, by the way, one of the things that I've always used them for was labeling builds. So I think it's pretty common. You go through the process in the build automation.
Yeah, V1.0, V1.2. Yeah, you'll have all of that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So you got, like you said, you've got your major, your minor, and then a build number, and maybe another revision number. But that build number increments up, and then you just kind of store that off into the Git repo. It makes it really easy for if you've got a game that's out there live and something goes wrong, you get a crash report, or you can repro it. You can see the version number in game, and then you can immediately sync your code to exactly what version it is right there, not have to try to figure that out and track it down. If you have a live game, I think it's I can't imagine not having some sort of labeling set up for being able to go back to a live version and being able to reproduce things, because it's always been extremely helpful for me, at least.
Something actually that came up on the current project I'm on, by the way, so kind of relevant to the question regarding conflicts. So I'm currently working on a project with like 15 people in it. It's a pretty complicated, back and forth, hefty project. And so we're using dependency injection, and there's an application root and a bunch of systems that are, quite frankly, touched on by lots of people, to the point where it's very likely to break all of the time for anybody to modify prefabs and that kind of thing. So the answer is, how do you deal with this complexity? Well, what a lot of people do is they make a separate branch and then work for ages and then hope when they merge it in later that the whole thing doesn't explode, which means you now have like let's hope the other people are on call. We can have a group call and figure it out. Well, you don't have to wait for them. You can do it the other way around. It's like the old saying of what is it? An ounce of prevention's worth a pound of cure. Is make a branch for you, and then make 2 or 3 commits, and then pull master or main or develop, whatever you're using, into your project and like align it presently, then make some more and align it presently. So I did that, where I did a huge refactor on one system in a large project, and I knew I would break stuff. I knew I was about to break lots of touching things across everyone else's projects. But rather than bother everyone else with doing that, I would take their changes into my branch, and I had someone work with me to test that while I did it. And so they were keeping relative parity the whole way. And then when the time came to do the official merge in, I only had to deal with like 1 or 2 different commits, and there was no real collisions. So the answer is, how do you deal with collisions? You just avoid having collisions by committing often and merge. You don't just go in one direction. This goes back to the whole thing about branches. Too many people are precious about having the right branch things and then doing the nice clean. No, I do what makes sense for the project, which is I don't want these to break. So if I have to yo-yo back and forth to keep everything perfectly in sync in 2 parallel matching branches, it's one line. It's literally just, git merge other branch name, done, get back to work. I just do that every few minutes, and my project is perpetually in a good state,
Yeah. And there, what you're talking about, like you're working on a branch on some refactor, and other people are constantly committing into your main branch, and you're just kind of pulling those changes from the main branch into your thing, so that while you're doing your refactor, you're getting all of those issues, instead of having to finish your refactor and then at the end you go in and now your refactor is not done. You have to go back and redo it for all this shit that's changed. And it may even, in some scenarios, like drastically change, like a small change that somebody else made may drastically change like a large amount of your code. It may not be like a big change, but it might be like even just a simple rename or rearranging of the way some event works or something.
And here's like a little sneaky tip that just, again, I find really useful, is the more assets you add to a project, the longer the compile time gets. And it gets to the point where you're asked for a pretty banal change of like, can you make it so that when this happens, this if statement runs and it does this and this thing changes? You're like, cool, that's pretty simple, but it's integrating with 4 or 5 lines of code in different systems, and I'm worried it'll break. So you make a change and then go to test it, like even just a number, like you want to change a number from 0.2 to 0.5, but you can't expose it in the editor for whatever reason. So you change it to a number, you wait for it to compile, you press play, you test it, you turn it off, you add 2 more to the number, you run it, you do it again, and it's exhausting. So if you have frequent commits, you can just go back in time to before all the big assets were added, have a lightweight version of the same project, write your code there, then go back to the top of the project and then pull your change back on top and just take your files that are different. So you can work in a faster iterative cycle on an older version of the project if it doesn't need all the assets that have been added by the art team. So,
yeah. Ideally, set it up so you don't need any of those.
And yes, LFS is mandatory. Absolutely, 100% mandatory for multiple reasons.
Well, guys, I need to bail, head back to work. But thanks for having me on again.
Yep. It's good talking to you both. I guess it's probably a good time to get going. So, yeah, thanks everybody for coming out. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons, and go check out. Oh, the 30 bundle ended. Go check out the multiplayer course stuff and Jason Story's Discord. If I can scroll down and find the link. There it is. Bam. And then we will be back, I think, next Friday, right? Nothing going on next Friday?
I think so.
Check next Friday is the 3rd. Yeah. So we'll be back next Friday. If you got a topic request or something else, just drop it in the comments below, and we'll check for that and see if maybe we can talk about whatever it is you guys are interested in next week, unless something else really cool comes up. All right. Any last words, guys?
Nope.
All right.
Commit right now. Commit often. There you go. Just a reminder.
Commit. All right.
People have commitment issues.
All right. Talk to y'all later. Bye.
Bye.